Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show. Here, the Andrew Lawton Show on this Wednesday, April 17th. Now, I have to apologize in advance a little bit if there's something indiscernibly different about the audio, by which I mean if there's a little bit more of an echo. So I was being the good son. I love dogs. So when I had an opportunity arise to dog sit my parents' lovely yellow lab, I naturally jumped at the opportunity. She's a beautiful little thing and is so well behaved, so mild mannered, so quiet. It's so lovely until yesterday, moments before I was about to go on air, I sat down and I smelled something and realized that she had to relieve herself overnight. And attempts to salvage the rug that served both an aesthetic and a soundproofing purpose for this show were unsuccessful. So we've just removed the rug altogether. And I noticed that when I was coming in, I can do the Ricola thing because it just has a bit of an echo in this room now. So this is the behind the scenes look at the Andrew Lawton Show you'd never know you were going to get. But nevertheless, it's good to have you tuned into the program here. Going to be breaking down, as promised yesterday, the latest from the federal budget, which I kind of did call, actually, because I had shared a meme online a couple of weeks back just about this. It was from this show, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, about these guys talking about a self-sustaining economy. The money moves around and around, and it's clear they didn't grasp at all how economics or finance or the financial system worked. And I had remarked that it seemed like it was the Liberal government planning the budget for this year. And then, of course, I heard the budget from last year, and I'm even more convinced that that was the case. We have more money being spent, no plan to balance the budget, projections that are changing above and beyond what last year's projections were, which were different from the year before. So the government isn't even sticking to its own projections and forecasts, let alone anything else. And in the end, what we have here is a system in which the government is pretending to be speaking up and standing for the middle class. They're trying to do all this big talking tough thing. They're saying, oh, yes, we're going to tax the rich. They're going to fiddle with the capital gains tax. They're going to make billions more through that, and they're going to use that to dump it into housing. And what's been fascinating here is how little confidence there is in Canada and what Canada is doing from a lot of people. If you've been following a lot of the tech world, the entrepreneurial world online, you'll see, and we have a story coming out about this a little bit later on this afternoon, a lot of people saying, what on earth is Canada doing here? Because they are stifling growth. The government is stifling entrepreneurship. And just to look into some of these numbers in a bit of detail here, I will do that, but I want to pull out some specifics first and foremost, because the government says, oh, yes, we have to be very tough with this. They're saying we're going to get rid of 5,000 federal public service roles through attrition. And then you hear the government also putting forward this little nifty graph here that I wanted to share with you. This is a graph showing the cumulative federal investments to support inclusion and combat hate. So by 2028, the federal government will have spent $1.1 billion on so-called inclusion and combating hate. Now, that is a lot of tampons in men's washrooms. I don't know what the unit cost of a tampon in a men's washroom is, but you probably need a lot of them to get to that $1.1 billion. Now, perhaps there are some other line items that come under that, but $1 billion to combat hate. And when you look at what the government defines as hate, we know that it's really just an excuse to shovel money to groups that are supporting a very liberal interpretation of what free speech should be, which is to say not something that is protected. And the government also found tens of millions of dollars for CBC. Oh, yes, the state broadcaster, above and beyond the $1.4 billion a year it already gets, now gets tens of millions of dollars more, I think 42 million was the exact number there, 42 million that CBC is now going to get when their executives were collecting millions of dollars in bonuses, all the while President Catherine Tate screams about the necessity to make layoffs and cut jobs. So CBC is talking about job losses. They're paying fat executive bonuses. And what do they get for all of this? But a big, giant reward from the federal government to the tune of $40 million plus. So that's where things are going there. Now, I find it interesting, just to set the stage here. This is a government that has been incredibly embattled. The carbon tax fight that Pierre Poilievre and most premiers have been taking up has been effective. It's been landing blows on the federal government. Take, for example, this clip from Andrew Furey, who is the Premier of Newfoundland. And before we play it, just a bit of context, there was a by-election loss that Newfoundland saw go incredibly dramatically towards the PCs. And this is what Andrew Furey, or towards the Liberals from the PCs. And this is what Andrew Furey had to say.
It used to be an asset being a friend of the Liberal Party federally. Now it seems like it's maybe not. You're talking about fighting them.
No, not fighting. I mean, I think, on the carbon tax in particular, the Prime Minister has tried to bait me at times with certain ad hominems and name calling almost. But look, we have a very different opinion on the carbon tax. It's not right for the people of the province. Right now, given the inflationary pressures, given the indirect costs and induced costs that trickles down to people's tables. We hear that. We understand that. I wish the Prime Minister would understand that. He's being very sclerotic in his approach on this ideologic marriage that he has to this principle. That's not to say that we don't believe in fighting climate change. We certainly do, but this policy is wrong for the people of the province right now.
The policy is wrong for the people of the province. Now, this is, I think, very interesting. He says Trudeau's trying to bait him. So he's basically taking the comments that Justin Trudeau has made and pushed them right back at the federal government. What Premier Furey is saying there is that this is just bad policy. It's nothing else. It's bad policy. It's bad for the people of the province. And that, to me, is, I think, a point that Justin Trudeau would, for his own benefit, his own political future, do well to take seriously. Now, we couldn't talk about the federal budget without talking about our old friend Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, who has, of course, had no shortage of criticisms about the budget. Let's share a couple of his tweets on this. Canadians are struggling, he says. This is one point here. There was a video. Pierre Poilievre is fighting to make his rich friends richer. Justin Trudeau had 9 years, but only acts when we force him to. We're not going to stop. We're going to take on corporate greed, and we're fighting to lower your bills. Then he also had this one to say here. Conservative handouts will continue. Justin Trudeau will keep Pierre Poilievre's $60 billion in taxpayer handouts to corporation. Thanks to Pierre and Justin, it's a good day for greedy Galen Weston and a bad day for you. And I think we have one more from the greatest hits of Jagmeet Singh here. Budget 2024 tells us two things that we already knew. One, New Democrats are lowering your bills. Two, Conservatives want to cut services for you and continue a $60 billion handout to corporations like Loblaw. Liberals don't have the courage to go after corporate greed. New Democrats do. Ooh, it sounds like Jagmeet Singh is not happy with the federal budget. He also had this to say at a press conference.
Is this a budget you will support?
So that's not a decision that we are making right now, and the reason for that is the following. While we fought for certain things in the budget that are very important, that are going to give relief to people, we have some serious concerns, and I want to hear from the Prime Minister what his plan is to address those concerns. What is his plan to address the fact that we're losing, his budget's going to cut 5,000 public sector employees? How does he ensure that we're still going to get good service for Canadians? What is the plan to ensure that Indigenous communities that for so long have not received adequate funding for infrastructure and housing, what's the plan to close that gap? What's the plan to address the fact that $500 or $200 a month for people living with disabilities is insufficient? What is a plan to address those concerns? So I want to hear that from the Prime Minister before we make a decision.
Oh, well, maybe we'll support it. I've got some criticisms. I've got some problems. Oh, it's terrible. But I don't know. Maybe if he tells me all this stuff, I'll support it. This was another clip from that same press conference yesterday.
A couple concerns you have with the budget as it exists. What kind of changes must you see in there to get support from the NDP on this one?
Well, there's one contrast that's very clear. While I've identified it again and again, the reason why your groceries are high, the reason why your cell phone bills are high, the reason why you can't afford housing is corporate greed. And the Liberals are failing to address that, and the Conservatives won't do that either. Conservatives and the Liberals are far too close to wealthy CEOs and big corporations to take on the real reason why your cost of living is so high. That's a contrast. It's clear to me that the Liberals and nor the Conservatives are ever going to address that. You'll need New Democrats to address that problem.
So
but in terms of the specific question, I need to hear a plan from the Prime Minister. What is his plan to respond to the concerns that I have before we make a decision?
But you listed a bunch of concerns there. Do you need all of those concerns filled? Like, what is the must-have of those concerns in order to secure your support?
Well, each and every one of those are very important concerns. So I want to hear what the plan is. Like, how is a Prime Minister going to guarantee that there's not massive cuts to services for Canadians with the cutting of 5,000 employees? How is he going to justify to people living with disabilities that $200 a month is enough to meet their needs? I need to hear a plan on that before we make a decision.
Last question. So is the supply agreement blown up now, sir, with your, we're not sure you're going to support the budget, you're ready to go into an election? Is this where we're at?
Where we're at right now is there's things in the budget that we fought for that are there. There's problems that we have. I want to hear what the plan is from the Prime Minister to address.
So he's basically saying, yeah, we're terrible. We don't like this. It's bad. But oh, no. Oh, no. I don't want to go to an election just yet. No, don't take that. Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. And then he starts touting all of these great achievements that he thinks are achievements. I'm not going to do the dancing video. I did the dancing video last time where he loses an election and then just does like a Bhangra dance on stage as though he has some reason to celebrate. But the thing about Singh here is that he could be, if he wanted to, one of the most influential figures in Canada, yet instead he is a lackey and a lapdog for Justin Trudeau, and does, I think, this incredibly harmful thing for the country, in which he says on one hand, yeah, this Liberal government, can you believe the stuff they're doing? Well, conveniently glossing over the fact that he has been voting for that. He has been voting for and endorsing that same Liberal government's conduct and activities. And again, I'll remind you of the fundamental point here. No plan to balance the budget at all. None whatsoever. Now, I had asked, there's a clip I saw just before we went on the show here from Christine Freeland. I don't know if we'll be able to get it in the show today, but she basically was asked in an interview if being balanced matters for the budget. And her answer was basically, well, I don't know. It's more important to be fiscally responsible than to have a balanced budget. So the federal government is basically committing to this idea that a balanced budget doesn't matter. It's a far cry from this old gem from Justin Trudeau.
So in this economic climate, how committed to a balanced budget would you be right now? Would it worry you to go into deficit in this current climate to, as you say, put more people to work?
The commitment needs to be a commitment to grow the economy, and the budget will balance itself.
Oh, the budget will balance itself. That was 9 years ago, 10 years ago, actually, almost. And to be honest, the budget has not balanced itself. I don't know when the budget is going to balance itself. I've been waiting so patiently as a taxpaying Canadian for the budget to balance itself. And yet I have seen no such balance take place. And even in the next 5 years, according to the Liberal government's latest projections, the budget does not seem keen on balancing itself. Now, perhaps if left to its own devices, the budget would balance itself. Then it would go and take a nice holiday and call it a day. But it strikes me as inconvenient that the Liberal government is balancing. Oh, except not actually, because that was only when they were convinced it would balance itself. And a decade later, almost, balanced budgets aren't all that important. No. It doesn't really, you don't need to balance the budget as long as it's fiscally responsible. Well, I'm not even seeing the fiscal responsibility baked into this budget that Christine Freeland is claiming is there. And we're going to talk about this in a few moments with someone who has the business perspective on this. And we'll also chat with our old friend, Franco Terrazzano, momentarily. But just to, again, put some context here, we are seeing a government that on one hand is trying to do this weird sort of class fighting thing where they say, oh, we're taking aim at the wealthy, we're taking aim at the rich, we're taking aim at all of that. And as we were talking about yesterday with Ryan Mallow from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, they do this while trying to sort of look at the so-called middle class, which is a group that admittedly can be a bit amorphous in politics, and say, we've got your back, we're supporting you. And this is what Jagmeet Singh is doing when he takes aim at corporate greed. He is trying to tell all of these people that all of their problems, all of the issues they have, the reason they can't afford groceries, it's not inflation, it's not the carbon tax, it's not bad financial policy, bad monetary policy. No, it's Galen Weston. Galen Weston is the reason that you can't afford groceries. Want to welcome into the show our good friend Catherine Swift. I got to see her in person last week at the Canada Strong and Free Network Conference. She is the president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Catherine, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. I love to talk budgets, Andrew. Just love it.
Well, I've seen over the last, 16 hours or whatever, 18 hours, a lot of people that are with big companies, people that have worked in the tech space, entrepreneurial space, that are saying everything that came out yesterday is just bad news for business. It's bad news for making Canada competitive. And I wanted to get your perspective on this. I mean, from an independent business perspective, but just in general for Canadian industry.
Yeah, it's very bad. Of course, the burgeoning deficits and debts are bad for every Canadian, and including business. So the fact they presented this as somehow a good budget for young people, I couldn't figure that one out, because the young people are going to be paying these massive deficits. And the fact that we now have our debt service is $54 billion just to pay interest on the debt. It is taking away from any productive services in our economy. So that's one aspect. This capital gains, bumping capital gains. I mean, to me, 50% is pretty rich to start with. Bumping that to 2/3 is unconscionable. And of course, business, everybody's saying, oh, it'll only affect the rich and so on and so forth. Oh, no, no, no. It'll certainly affect business, investments on the part of business, assets that may have. They easily can meet that $250,000 threshold. Anybody who has businesses that have a business premise, perhaps, or a few business premises, and they want to reorganize that, they're going to be facing charges there. We see anyone that has a second residence, for that matter, a cottage, say, or whatever, which a lot of very middle class people do, and plan to leave it to their kids. Well, now their kids are going to get dinged with a whole bunch more. And the overall, the funny thing is, Freeland acknowledged our productivity problem a little while ago. Mind you, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's pretty hard not to acknowledge it. But what she has done in this budget is only going to worsen our productivity issue. And maybe people think that's some sort of theoretical economic concept, but our productivity is our standard of living. And we know our standard of living has been stagnant ever since this Trudeau government's been in power. And what's the most important thing to enhance productivity is investment. Investment has already fled Canada, because our government we can't get anything built. We can't get anything done. We have building permits that go on for 10, you don't get something for 10 years. It's utterly ridiculous. But we've already killed investment. This capital gains change is going to kill it even more. And that's our standard of living again. So I just don't get what version of economics, none I've ever seen, they're basing their thinking on. And boy, I sure hope we have an election sooner rather than later, because I think most Canadians are figuring out that they're getting badly hurt by this government, and it's certainly not helping the broader picture at all.
And Chrystia Freeland, I should point out here, and you noted this in a statement yesterday, had previously said that we were going to keep the deficit under $40 billion, as though we're supposed to be grateful for such fiscal prudence with a deficit that's only $40 billion. Now, it came in just under that. We're at $39.8 billion. Now, you're suspecting that if you lift the hood there and take a look around, there's going to be some creative accounting just to get it below that target.
Absolutely. No, the fact that she focused on it so much prior to the budget, I thought, oh, they're going to pull some fast one here that won't be apparent right off the bat. But to make that, because she's always talked about, oh, I have my guardrails and I have my, all these things that she's not supposed to go past the red line. And yet she's gone over every red line she set for herself since. So this one, I wasn't surprised to see it barely it was by $200 million, I believe it was under the 40 billion. But I would bet serious money today, Andrew, that will never be achieved. When we get the final data, this isn't the final data for the fiscal year. We don't get that till usually around September. And I think once we see those accounts, we'll see that it's even worse. And going forward, of course, as you said, there's clearly no attempt at all to come toward balance. There's the kind of reduction by a few billion a year. I don't believe that'll happen either. We're going to see, and again, interest rates are a plague on Canadians right now. And the higher, the more debt they go into, the more they tax Canadians. The higher they keep interest rates for longer. Because the Bank of Canada has already said the government's fiscal policy is running absolutely contrary to the Bank of Canada's monetary policy. So that prevents, I mean, we all want to see interest rates come down. A lot of Canadians have yet to renew a mortgage at those higher rates, and they're going to get hammered when that happens. Some already have been hammered. That won't happen as long as this government pursues these kinds of policies. They're just making it worse for everyone.
Yeah, and I want to rhyme off some of the numbers here since you bring up the deficit. So we have the projection for this budget year, $39.8 billion as a deficit. Next year, 38.9 billion. The year after, 30.8 billion. 2027, 2028, 26.8 billion. The end of the projections, 2028 to 2029, the budgetary deficit will be down to $20 billion. So no plan to balance the budget. And if you go at that rate, it would probably take another decade to get there. And what's interesting, too, is if you look at the debt as a percentage of GDP, that number is relatively stagnant. It goes from, 42 to 41.5 to 40.8 to 40 to 39. So we're still going to be at 39% of our debt as a percentage of GDP within 5 years if the Liberals have their way. And as you note, that is not taking into account interest rates, which could throw a tremendous wrench. It just as, individual homeowners are beholden to changes in interest rates, so too is the government here. So maybe they're being so reckless because they know they're not going to be around beyond a year and a half from now, and this will be someone else's problem. But how do you justify this at all?
You don't, not in any sane manner. I don't believe any of these targets will be met. And I have come to believe, I don't like to wear my tinfoil hat too often, but I have come to believe that they are making this as bad as it can possibly be for the next government, which looks like it's going to be Pierre Poilievre government. So that they just have a horrific time. And then, of course, they'll criticize them, right? How could you ever have such a big deficit? And let's not forget, these are the guys that were only going to run those modest 10 billion deficits until 2019 when the budget would be balanced. Also, this budget makes assumptions about growth in the economy that look overly optimistic. That's another consideration because they have to assume the economy is going to grow by, X percent in the future years. And I think we're heading for some serious trouble here. Again, investors around the world, foreign investment's a big deal in Canada. Our dollar has fallen. And by the way, a falling dollar, we import a lot into Canada too. A falling dollar means more inflation because our dollar doesn't buy as much. And every single thing they've done here is leading toward making all of these critical measures that affect all of our everyday lives worse. And so it's very depressing, of course. But I wonder how they can really, I wonder how they can justify it in their own minds, how they can look in the mirror at themselves with the damage they're doing. But what seems to be interesting is they seem to be thinking maybe they almost act as if they haven't been in government for the last 8.5 years. And Trudeau saying, oh, geez, we got an awful lot of immigration. What could have happened there? And Freeland, commenting on, oh, darn, we got all this, debt interest we have to pay. Shucks, who did that? And we get all this. I wonder if it's that there was supposedly a new communications guy hired in the PMO back last year. And I wonder if this is the new strategy. Sort of pretend they didn't do any of this in the last 8.5 years. If so, I don't think Canadians are going to be fooled.
Yeah, very well said on that. They do tend to just be very surprised that they've been at the helm for the last 8 years and things just happen. It's Stephen Harper's fault. I think they're still blaming Arthur Meehan for the budgetary deficit, probably. Catherine Swift, always good to talk to you. You are doing great work over there, standing up for business and industry in Canada, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew.
All right. Thanks very much. Catherine Swift of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada, formerly of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. So she knows this file very well. Wanted to check in on this from just a taxpayer perspective of, well, we've done the business side, going to do the consumer taxpayer side. Although, as we know full well, there is only one taxpayer. And any measures that penalize business will always end up screwing the little guy, as well as we've noted with carbon taxes. I mean, even if you have a policy that's going to be an industrial polluter-based thing where they try to go after the big industry, it still trickles down to ordinary Canadian taxpayers. You're always going to be footing the bill, even when, the government is paying. So it's funny when you hear the rhetoric from Chrystia Freeland, we're giving, we're doing this, we're spending, no. We the people listening to you, we the taxpayers are the ones paying for this. You are not paying for anything. The $1 billion you're spending on combating hate is me. The money you're giving to CBC is me. The deficit spending is me that has to pay. All of you. I mean, I got my little tiny, teeny little itsy bitsy share of it. You've got your own share, but we are the ones that are getting hosed on this. And this is why there's just this giant shell game with all of this. And I get so frustrated. And I know that budgets aren't always the most fascinating thing to talk about. I get that. But it matters tremendously when you have government treating the taxpayers with such disrespect. And Catherine Swift mentioned the interest payments. This is actually an important point. I saw an observation yesterday online, and I didn't pull the tweet, but basically the amount that the federal government collects on GST is I think it's $51 billion a year. The amount that the federal government collects on GST pays for the interest that we pay on our federal debt, the interest. So that means anytime you pay GST, it's general revenue, but I'm saying the amount is the same. So anytime you pay GST, know that money is actually going towards nothing. That is going towards paying the interest payment on the federal government's credit card. That does not build you a road. It does not build you a hospital. It does not get you another episode of Rosie Barton's show. It provides absolutely, well, that one's probably good, but it provides you nothing. That is what happens when you have such a debt-laden country. One of the only guys in Canada who gets this is Franco Terrazzano, who is the federal director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and joins us once again. Franco, you didn't get your wish list, it looks like.
Oh, I sure didn't, right? And hey, welcome to Canada, where you pay a federal sales tax so Prime Minister Justin Trudeau can cover the interest on his government's credit card. You know what? I'm so glad you started with the interest charges, because this is what is so bizarre, just how expensive the interest charges on the debt have become. So now taxpayers are losing out on more than $1 billion every single week just to pay interest on the federal government debt. You mentioned that it's now $54 billion, which is the exact same amount of money that the federal government is bringing in through the GST. So ponder that the next time you're waiting in the checkout line. But also, what we're paying on interest charges this year is more money than what the federal government will send to the provinces in health transfers. Okay, so let all of this sink in and just imagine what we could do if we didn't have these ballooning debt costs. Okay, you could essentially remove the entire GST, or you could double health transfers. But instead, taxpayers are paying more than $1 billion every single week on interest charges. That money, it ain't building more hospitals. It ain't fixing the roads. It ain't staying in your pockets, because that money's going to the bond fund managers on Bay Street.
And when you look at a budget that has no path to balance, not even like an aspirational pie in the sky, in 5 years we're going to balance it plan, no projection that goes there whatsoever.
No. I mean, look, guys, we're running I'm not running a $40 billion deficit.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're in the clear here. We're just paying for it.
They're running a $40 billion deficit after they just brought in a massive tax hike. So even with a massive tax hike, they're still running a $40 billion deficit. And like, let's just think about it for a second. This is 2024. There isn't like a pandemic, and yet they're still running a deficit that would have been unheard of only a couple years ago. And you mentioned it, there is no plan to balance the budget. The best that this government can muster is, hey, in 5 years from now, we'll try to run a $20 billion deficit. But Andrew, just between me and you, don't let anyone know this, but I don't think this government will ever balance the budget.
No, and I must admit, I'm slightly concerned because I've talked about this with Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. He's obviously the one most poised to be the prime minister if current polling holds. And I've said, like, how are you going to get the budget to balance when this is what you're inheriting? And already, and I'm sympathetic to it, he has to start hedging and saying, well, we don't know what we're going to be left with. And the problem is when the government leaves something this bad, it is going to take an incredibly difficult and disciplined approach to bring it to balance. I mean, how quickly, realistically, could that happen?
Okay, well, let me set the stage because I was pouring through the numbers, as you know I like to do. And, I was bringing up the budget from 2021, only a couple years ago. And every time they do a budget, they project spending into the future. That's how they do it. Well, guess what, folks? If Trudeau just stuck with his big spending pandemic budget from 2021, and he just spent like how he said he was going to spend, there would be a balanced budget this year.
Huh.
That's all it would have taken. Just stuck to the big spending budget of 2021 from the Trudeau government, and you would have a balanced budget this year, right? Because as inflation takes money out of Canadians' pockets, you hear the NDP talk about greedflation. Well, the greedflation is also coming from the government, because their tax revenues, their revenues are also going through the roof. So, I know the state of the finances are in an awful place, right? The last budget that we just saw yesterday is an absolute dumpster fire. But the good news for Canadians is that it would only take a very modest level of spending restraint to actually balance the books. All you would have to do is just stick to the spending plan that Trudeau made when he gave out his big spending budget 2021.
I want to get you to react to this clip here. Chrystia Freeland was asked if the federal government cares about a balanced budget, and this is what she said.
Now, I also want to talk about your financial guardrails here, because I appreciate that your government has kept to your economic guardrails. But there is no path to balance. You heard the criticism. You've heard it before. There were no cuts made to reduce the $40 billion deficit that was posted today or predicted past one and then going forward for the next fiscal year. Does a balanced budget matter to you or your government at all?
I'll tell you what matters to me. What matters to me is a fiscally responsible budget. What matters to me is maintaining Canada's AAA credit rating, which is the basis for the ratings of all provinces, which is the basis for the ratings of businesses in our banking sector. What matters to me is maintaining a fiscally responsible budget and sticking within our guardrails, because the Bank of Canada has been clear that those guardrails are helpful to the Bank of Canada. And so I know by sticking within them, which I have done, I help to create the conditions that make it possible for the Bank of Canada to lower rates. And we've had some good news on that front just today. Today, we had the March inflation numbers, 2.9%. February was 2.8. January was 2.9. I would contrast 2.9 in March with 3.5 in the United States, which, by the way, is running a far more expansive fiscal policy. For the past 3 months in a row, inflation has been within the Bank of Canada's target range. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's very important for me to run a fiscally responsible policy. I am doing that. And the final thing I would say to you, Michael, is, there are some issues on which reasonable people can have different points of view. It's a matter of opinion, of ideology. You can argue whether gun control is good or bad. You can argue whether a woman's right to choose is good or bad. But the simple fact is Canada has the most responsible fiscal approach of any G7 country. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio, and it's coming down. We have the lowest deficit to GDP, and that is coming down too. We have a AAA credit rating. It is not, I'll tell you what, the people who work in ratings agencies, these guys are not liberal partisans, these guys and gals.
If you were, by the way, driving when now I've frozen for whatever. If you were driving when that went on, I apologize. I hope you didn't fall asleep at the wheel. But so number one, props to Chrystia Freeland for answering a question about do you care about balanced budgets with invoking gun control and women's right to choose. I didn't see that one coming. I didn't see that plot twist. But the answer was a long way of saying no. She thinks it's a fiscally responsible budget that matters, which I suspect, Franco, you also disagree disagree with the assertion that this budget falls into that category.
Of course it's not fiscally responsible. A $40 billion deficit. There's nothing fiscally responsible about that. And look, I keep hearing this like idea that they have these fiscal guardrails in place, as if you just say fiscal guardrail and that's a good thing. Like, you know, summer's coming up. I got to trim down a little bit before I go to the beach. So it's like me saying, you know what? I'm going to stick to my diet. I'm going to do a very good job and stick to my diet. Only one problem. The diet is 10,000 calories a day. Yeah, it's pretty easy for me to stick to a diet when it's that high. You know what I'm saying? Like, there is nothing fiscally responsible about this government. This government has proved time and again that it doesn't care about balanced budget, that it doesn't care about the fact that it is now doubling the entire national debt since the 2015 election. And by the way, folks, the whole brand of this budget is fairness for future generations. Well, doubling the entire debt and making Canadians' kids and grandkids continue to make payments on the federal debt for the rest of their lives, there is nothing fair about that. And look, there is no plan to find savings in this budget. There is no plan to balance the budget. The only plan that this government has is to take as much money from taxpayers as it can. And in last year's budget, by the way, Freeland said that she would find $15 billion in savings over a handful of years. Well, let's check in on that progress. This year, the federal government is increasing spending by $37 billion. So, newsflash, when you increase spending by $30 billion in one year, you're saving money wrong.
Yeah, I think you're bang on there, and we would perhaps be better suited having you as finance minister, although you've previously poo-pooed such nominations on your part. Franco Terrazzano, federal director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Always a pleasure, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Andrew.
All right, thank you, Franco. And again, good to catch up with him last week in Ottawa as well. It was like a big old Andrew Lawton Show family reunion. All our favorite guests under one roof. We should have had a designated survivor in place in case calamity hit. We could have just carried on the show. So, all right, well, that does it for the budget stuff. I wanted to do a bit of a counterbalance, give you that red meat culture war content you crave, and throw to this interview I did last week at the big old conference with Christine Van Geyn. Take a look. Well, civil liberties have been under attack in Canada for certainly 4 years, and we've seen this war being waged in provinces, municipalities, and certainly the federal government. And when people ask me how I remain so chipper and cheery about it, the only answer I have is that there are a great many people, probably not as many as there should be, that take on the fight and push back against this. And there has been one organization that stands out above many others that has been at the forefront of that, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, whose litigation director, Christine Van Geyn, is a mainstay on the Andrew Lawton Show and joins me in person today. Christine, great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me on, Andrew.
And I should say congratulations first and foremost. I've had you on to talk about, hold it up there, to talk about the book Pandemic Panic, which has now been nominated for the Donner Prize, which is quite a prestigious, shortlisted for it, quite a prestigious award. It was not one bestowed upon my book on the Freedom Convoy.
It should have been.
Well, thank you. But the Freedom Convoy book was cited in here. So
many
I get
times.
I get like 157th of the glory.
Several footnotes of glory.
All right. Well, my several footnotes of glory is actually the name of my memoir, I believe, that I'm penning right now. But well done. What do you take from that? I actually don't know what the nomination criteria are. So what is it that you're really being recognized for?
So it's the top prize for public policy writing in Canada. It's a $60,000 prize. There's 5 books that get shortlisted. There's a jury that reviews nearly 100 books that get submitted for consideration. They narrow that down to 5 books for the shortlist. And the idea is that it is not just a history, it's a public policy book. So the book needs to include recommendations for things for the future. And that's a big part of what's in Pandemic Panic. In fact, the last part of the book is a series of recommendations for what individuals can do to improve civil liberties in Canada and help better hold governments to account. Because the things that happened during the pandemic, a lot of them were illegal, a lot of them were completely inexcusable. But if we don't remember the lessons and if we don't learn to hold our governments to account, we are absolutely bound to repeat them in whatever the next crisis or imagined crisis is.
Yeah, you're right about that. And you and I have talked on the show about this mootness fallacy that government likes to advance where, well, this was just a really hyper-specific circumstance, and they do that to really deflect against people looking back to prevent abuse in the future. And, you know, it's a ridiculous example, but it's an incredibly useful one. Niagara region declaring an eclipse emergency. We talked about this on the show. They basically said, oh, yes, this eclipse is coming up, and there are going to be a lot of tourists. We're going to declare this as an emergency. And CCF criticized this, and in the end, we didn't see, you know, like police horses coming in and trampling people that were looking up at the sun, but it was still government at a municipal level or a regional level using powers that are not meant for that and using them without any real worry of the implications of that. And I think that really proves your thesis here, which is why these issues are so important to have so that that category of what an emergency is doesn't perpetually broaden.
Yeah, and I think one of the concerns, look, the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act in Ontario, it's provincial legislation, very different in nature from the Federal Emergencies Act. The powers in the Federal Emergencies Act are a lot broader. It allows the federal government to create new criminal law, essentially by executive order. The things, and they did pretty extreme things with those powers when they invoked the state of emergency federally. I mean, they froze bank accounts, they prohibited gatherings. In Niagara region, the powers under emergency declaration are more limited, but they still give the government the power to do things like perhaps ration goods or impose a curfew. Those would be permitted under the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act. And if we broaden what is considered an emergency to include an entirely foreseeable event like an eclipse.
It's been scheduled for like 40 years.
We literally know when the next one is happening 90 years from now or 120 years from now or whatever it is. It's a very predictable event. If we call that an emergency, then I already know what's going to happen. Social activists across the province, across the country are going to argue that all kinds of social issues, serious ones, but still social issues, of a systemic nature that are addressed through public policy, they're going to say those are emergencies. Homelessness is an emergency. Climate change is an emergency. The opioid crisis, that's an emergency. We need emergency powers like a curfew or a rationing of goods to deal with these social issues. Some politicians locally are already attempting this, declaring homelessness or opioid emergencies. This is not what that legislation was designed to do. There's a statutory definition of emergency, and it's a situation of a temporary nature that is a serious danger to persons or property. And an eclipse just doesn't meet that threshold.
Yeah, and to go back, when you mentioned climate emergency, like it wasn't that long ago that any politician or commentator who mentioned that there could be such a thing as that was told to be a conspiracy theorist. And I think that's really short-sighted to make that claim. And one example, if I go back to the Ontario the Ontario Court of Appeal hearing some years back on the carbon tax, which I was sitting through, and you were arguing, I believe you were representing the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in that one.
Oh, yeah, I was.
Yeah, but, you know, there you had the David Suzuki Foundation arguing that the carbon tax was justifiable under federal government's emergency powers. Now, this is not the Emergencies Act. This is the emergency powers in the Constitution. But that's not new, that idea of activists really co-opting emergency language to make policy prescriptions just because they think that's their way to do it. So I am very concerned about that mission creep and redefinition of emergency.
Yeah, I think that, and this all kind of ties back to the book. It's a kind of mentality that some people have called safetyism, where safety is the governing sacred value of society, and our whole lives should be organized as that is the most important thing in our life. And I just fundamentally disagree with that worldview. I think that the organizing value of liberal democracies is freedom and liberty, not safety. And these two things are not necessarily incompatible with one another. But if you put safety ahead of freedom, we're going to see a terrible erosion of our fundamental freedoms that have served Western liberal democracies well for hundreds of years.
To pivot to an issue that I don't want to say more pressing, but certainly one that's more timely politically, Bill C-63. This is the federal government's Online Harms Act, and you and I have spoken about this on the show in the past. So I don't want to rehash those conversations, except to say that with all of the criticisms that have been brought by people, like I'm a bad faith actor to the government. I don't expect them to listen to me. I think they should probably listen to people like you, but even people that are far more mainstream in their views than a lot of the critics on C-63 have been raising some of the very similar criticisms, and the government showed no willingness to really give an inch on this. They're not really saying, yeah, maybe we're overplaying our hand on the hate speech stuff, or maybe we could separate out the online hate speech from the child sexual exploitation and revenge porn. And I think it's politically different, or politically understandable why they're doing that. Legally, I understand that they're going to face challenges on this stuff immediately. Are you optimistic that free speech challenges against C-63, when it becomes law eventually, will go the right way in court with how courts have viewed freedom of expression issues?
I actually am optimistic that certain provisions of this legislation will be challenged almost immediately. I think the biggest ones relate to the criminal law amendments. I think that
something like the peace bond.
The peace bond provisions and the standalone hate offense, which has the potential to, if someone commits an offense that is then motivated by hatred, that can be a standalone offense and can come with a maximum penalty of life imprisonment.
No, the PMO says that's not true. Supriya Dwivedi did her column. She said that's not about that at all.
I literally don't know what she is talking about. Yeah. She seems to think that because there are principles of sentencing that overcharging won't happen and that there's zero risk associated with this, but she's not operate on the ground in the criminal law sphere. And I'm telling you that this is a piece of that is probably the most constitutionally vulnerable piece of Bill 63. The peace bond provisions, that there's nothing like these peace bonds in any legislation because it's a prohibition on future speech, not future action. It's very, very different in nature and inherently a lot more speculative. And it's tied to the squishy definition, the statutory definition that derives from human rights law about what hatred is. So putting all of this into the criminal law context and tying it to the possibility of life imprisonment, very constitutionally vulnerable. I am optimistic that a constitutional challenge of that part of the legislation will be successful. And look, if it passes in its current form, we at the Canadian Constitution Foundation may be the ones to bring that challenge.
Well, I hope you will, and I wish you well with it. Congratulations again on the shortlisting,
thank
Christine.
You. I mean, I hope it's not us because I hope they don't pass this legislation.
You need to find another alliteration when you write your speech version of Pandemic Panic about all the online hate stuff. I don't know what you're going to call that book, but you got to write another one.
Oh, alliteration is great.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Christine Van Geyn, Litigation Director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation. That's it. As I was talking, the wheels were turning as I tried to come up with that alliteration, but I fell short. But in any event, always great to talk to Christine. Tomorrow, we will share my lengthy fireside chat with New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs. That is tomorrow on the Andrew Lawton Show. Plus, we'll have some other goodies for you as well. I don't know what they are yet, but we'll come up with some. In the meantime, thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to the Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.